Symbio presents Cultivate, written by Christian Zero. Once upon a joyous farm, a burgeoning chef named Patina tried her hand at a new recipe. In these moments and in this place, something unique was happening in a coexisting realm. This coexisting realm was home to a dominant species called Provios, who called their homeland Mira. Within this realm of Mira toiled a young Provios named Etman. His job was to cultivate an important form of food called pribia for his people. As such, he was considered a biasmo. If he were human, he may have been called a farmer, but in Mira, the pribia was a mercurial food source which only came into existence under unique conditions. So, unlike human farmers, the biasmo could not rely on the same actions time and again. The pribia was different than human food and came into existence through light projections generated by the biasmo into fertile pockets of atmosphere within Mira. These light projections alone, however, were not enough to cultivate the exotic pribia for harvest. The light needed to be encoded with imagination to form a uniquely enticing microcosm. This required creativity and great ideas. Young Etman was confident he could be a fruitful biasmo. He'd spent many years in school training for this responsibility and had often felt like he didn't even need the training. Finally, an exhausted elder biasmo relinquished his pocket of atmosphere to be cultivated by the young Etman. Teeming with excitement, he got right to it, throwing together ideas he'd seen from other biasmo. Meanwhile, on the farm, Patina was in the kitchen and had her ingredients all prepped together in a pot. She mixed them with her bare hands vigorously until her muscles were sore and brine had swelled to the surface. She then prepared the recipe for fermentation, making sure she followed all the steps. Then she waited. Etman was already waiting, smugly, in anticipation of a fine first crop of pribia. Time continued to pass. A sinking feeling began to take hold in his stomach. His assembled light field began to fade. Not a single pribia had arisen. Etman was dismayed. Weeks later, Patina took a sample taste of her first jar of sauerkraut to see how it was coming along. It wasn't. Other than saltiness, it was dull in flavor and lifeless. Sauerkraut with no sourness. Humbled, Etman paused to check inside and realized his career as a biasmo was not a given. He wished for his first successful crop. This kind of imagination would take much more work, and work he did. Patina, meanwhile, did some research, racked her brain, and came up with a potential solution for the sauerkraut. More warmth, more time. Eventually, his second microcosm was complete, and like magic, his first crop of pribia were coming into being. Etman was delighted. Meanwhile, Patina checked back in with her sauerkraut to see it bubbling with life. She gazed at it with childlike wonder. The next evening, Edmund returned to his pocket and was shocked to see that his Pribia had been stolen. He froze, distraught. In the kitchen, it was time for the sauerkraut to be refrigerated, and in it went. Edmund wondered who could have done this. Going to market, it became immediately clear, for there was only one Pribia harvest available, and it was being offered by a group of Biasmo known as the Fashion Apes. They were many and popular with the Provios, and Edmund was a lone being. He turned away and channeled his anger into creating a new microcosm. Checking in, he was mindful not to let the anger taint his work. He wished for another successful creation. Meanwhile, Patina brought some kraut out to share with her musician friend, Linda, upon some fresh, over-easy eggs. In Mira, within the humble pocket of atmosphere Edmund had to work with, a great microcosm had been created, and beautiful Pribia were already beginning to populate it. Around the kitchen table, Patina's sauerkraut was a hit. Linda added olive oil and certainly ate more than a garnished portion. Before nightfall, Edmund had harvested the early but tiny Pribia, just in case the Fashion Apes might come to take it otherwise. When he came back later that night, however, the entire microcosm was gone. The Fashion Apes had managed to transplant it into their big pocket, and the Pribia began flowing through like liquid gold. Edmund was devastated. His ability to contribute a miracle to the Provios had seemingly been taken from him. Consumed with anger, resentment, and bitterness, Edmund decided to leave his pocket and began traveling through Mira, not really clear on where he was going. After cooling off and checking in, he realized how very alone he was with all of this. He wished for connection. Soon, to his surprise, he met a beautiful Provios named Bianca. They connected, they danced, and they went on a whimsical journey together. At the same time, the sauerkraut in Linda's stomach was moving through the small intestine. Meanwhile, the Fashion Apes were running into some difficulties. The Pribia they were harvesting from the microcosm they had stolen from Edmund were turning into plastic on their way to the market. The Provios were getting sick and soon became sick of the Fashion Apes. The sauerkraut had moved into the large intestine now, where bad bacteria had been hiding. To Edmund's surprise, just as suddenly as he had met Bianca, she disappeared. He had no idea where she went and was confused more than anything at first. Then the recurring feeling of a lost potential settled in. Edmund went numb, blocking the grief trying to move through him. In an attempt to move on, he continued traveling around Mira, unsure what he was looking for. Back at the market, Pribia continued to run in short supply. The Provios were struggling without this integral nutrient. many plagued with sickness. Meanwhile, feeling nervous about her first musical performance to a large crowd, Linda frantically paced around her studio. As Edmund traveled aimlessly, he was taken aback to see that he was right back in the sector of Mira where he had started. This prompted him to check in again. The resentment and bitterness returned. A quiet voice came to his mind, however, pointing out how nature was neither bitter nor resentful. Nature is magnanimous. Nature is graceful. Nature is forgiving. Nature is generative and generous and never stops creating. He sat with this, opening himself up. He was then flooded with grief, which he allowed to move through him forcefully. Back on the farm, Bettina noticed how anxious Linda was getting and suggested she sit to meditate and focus on her breathing. So she did. Somewhat to Edmund's surprise, the grief passed. And continuing to go within, he found himself in a liminal space, a space of quiet, potent possibility. In this space, he wished for a miracle. He wished to contribute a miraculous crop for the Provios and to be seen by them for his contribution. Then, at the thought of this, he felt pressure upon his shoulders, anxiety, overwhelm. It felt like too much. He continued to journey inward. Edmund found himself once again in a pure and liminal space, reflecting on the message he'd received from the magnanimous voice of nature. It was then he realized he was the miracle. Linda, meanwhile, performed a magnificent set. Edmund, witnessing his own greatness, found sympathy for the fashion apes and their struggle, and forgave them within himself. Unconcerned with the threat of thieves or failure, Edmund went about creating a new microcosm from a place of love and purity. After a beautiful start, he chose to extend an olive branch to the struggling fashion apes, offering for them to work with him. The other Biasmo excitedly joined forces, including Bianca, who found her way back to Edmund, and they were able to use a much bigger pocket to project their microcosm. A symbiotic dynamic formed amongst the Biasmo, and the completed microcosm was greater than any of them had imagined. Not only did it birth more Pribia to cultivate than ever before, they were a rare and legendary species of dancing Pribia. Back in Linda's large intestine, the bad bacteria hiding there was confronted by the good bacteria upon the sauerkraut she'd eaten. After some healthy conflict, the beneficial bacteria began transmuting nearby nutrients into nourishment for Linda's body. Meanwhile, Edmund, along with other noble Biasmo, was able to bring joyous nutrition to all the Provios of Mira, who lived happily ever after. The next morning, Linda went to the washroom, opened the window, and sat down. Soon, satisfied and ready to start the day, she flushed the toilet. Edmund, meanwhile, felt Mira shifting into a colder, more fluid climate. He felt refreshed and excited for the future. The end.